Bondi Beach, a paradise of golden sand and endless summer. But on December 14th, 2025, the sun set on a festival of light and rose on a scene of terror. This is the story of the 60 minutes that changed a nation. Welcome to Verified Crime Files. Thanks for the support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. And when you're done watching, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share. Thank you. The light on the coast of New South Wales possesses a distinct, crystalline quality in mid-December, a harsh clarity that softens only as the sun begins its descent over the urban ridge of Bondi. On Sunday, December 14th, 2025, the meteorological data recorded a mean temperature of 22.8 degrees Celsius, a reprieve from the oppressive humidity that often characterizes the early Australian summer. The wind blew at a moderate 12 knots, whipping the tops of the swells into whitecaps that rolled relentlessly toward the golden crescent of the beach. Bondi is not merely a geographical location. It is a sociological phenomenon, the intersection of hedonistic surf culture and the dense, multicultural urbanity of Sydney's eastern suburbs. On this particular Sunday, the atmosphere was thick with the languor of the weekend winding down. The traffic on Campbell Parade, the arterial road that separates the sand from the commercial strip, was a slow-moving river of silver sedans and SUVs. The cafes were full, the air scented with the complex perfume of roasting coffee, frying oil, and salt spray. However, the northern end of the beach, specifically the area known as Archer Park, vibrated with a different energy. Archer Park is a small, grassy depression located just north of the Bondi Surf Bathers Life-Saving Club, a space often used for picnics and overflow from the beach, but on this evening, it had been transformed into a sacred space. The date marked the beginning of Hanukkah, the Jewish festival of lights. The event, billed as Hanukkah by the Sea, was organized by the Chabad of Bondi and had drawn a crowd estimated at nearly 1,000 people. A giant menorah stood as the focal point, while carnival rides and a petting zoo drew squeals of delight from toddlers. The smell of lax frying in oil mingled with the oceanic ozone. Among the crowd moved Reuven Morrison, a philanthropist and businessman who had emigrated from the Soviet Union in the 1970s. As the sun lowered, casting long, melancholic shadows across the grass, Reuven was seen laughing with Rabbi Eli Schlanger near the stage, discussing the logistics of the lighting ceremony. They were unaware that 50 meters away, a silver hatchback had just pulled to the curb, carrying a darkness that was about to shatter their world. To fully comprehend the magnitude of the violence that was about to be unleashed upon the unsuspecting families at Bondi, one must first dissect the claustrophobic and toxic psychology of the perpetrators, Sajid and Naveed Akram. The journey from their home in Bonnyrigg, in Sydney's southwest, to the glittering coast of the eastern suburbs was a physical transit of less than 50 kilometers. Yet, ideologically, they were traveling between two irreconcilable universes. Sajid Akram, a 50-year-old father, operated as the architect of this familial terror cell, a role that fits the grim sociological profile of the insider, radicalizer who seals off his dependents from the moderating influences of the outside world. Research into the psychology of such dyads suggests that the father-son dynamic is particularly lethal because it leverages the natural biological hierarchy of the family unit to enforce compliance and secrecy. There is no need for encrypted apps or dark web forums when a conspiracy is forged at the dinner table. As they sat in their silver hatchback, navigating the Sunday afternoon traffic that clogged the arterial roads leading toward the ocean, the silence between them was likely heavy with the gravity of their pact. They were not merely traveling to a crime scene. They were embarking on a final, nihilistic pilgrimage. The items in the trunk of their vehicle, high-powered long-arm rifles and homemade, improvised explosive devices, were not acquired on a whim, but were the result of meticulous, cold-blooded planning that had evaded the surveillance nets of the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, despite the father being known to authorities on a peripheral level. This failure of intelligence was not a result of incompetence, but a testament to the insular nature of their radicalization. They were a self-contained ecosystem of hate, impervious to external detection because they emitted no signals beyond the walls of their own home. By the time the silver hatchback turned on at Campbell Parade at approximately 6:40 p.m., the transformation of Sajid and Naveed Akram from civilians into active combatants was complete. Campbell Parade is the beating heart of Bondi's commercial district, a boulevard lined with surf shops, ice cream parlors, and bustling cafes where tourists and locals mingle in a chaotic, vibrant dance of summer leisure. The Akrams, however, were blind to the beauty of the setting. Their focus was purely tactical. They sought a position that would offer them dominance over their target, and they found it in the stone footbridge that spans the car park and leads toward the grassy incline of Archer Park. This specific piece of infrastructure was chosen with a military eye for enfilade fire. It provided an elevated platform that overlooked the Hanukkah by the sea, gathering while offering a degree of cover from the street below. As they parked the car, just 15 meters from the bridge entrance, they were indistinguishable from the thousands of other visitors seeking a parking spot, a terrifying example of how easily malice can camouflage itself within the mundane. They exited the vehicle with a calm that belied their intent. Sajid in his black long-sleeved shirt and white trousers, Naveed dressed entirely in black, a uniform of death chosen to blend into the shadows that would soon fall. They retrieved their weapons from the trunk, a moment of extreme exposure that went unnoticed in the bustle of the beachfront, and began their short walk toward the bridge. They were not running. They were hunting, moving with the deliberate pace of men who believed they were agents of destiny rather than architects of atrocity. While the Akrams were securing their weapons on the street above, the atmosphere inside Archer Park was one of transcendent joy and communal resilience. The Hanukkah by the Sea event had transformed the humble grassy depression near the North Bondi Surf Life Saving Club into a vibrant tableau of Jewish life, drawing a crowd of nearly 1,000 people to celebrate the Festival of Lights. At the center of this gathering was Reuven Morrison, a man whose life story was a testament to the very survival of the Jewish spirit that the attackers sought to extinguish. Born in the Soviet Union, Reuven had emigrated to Australia as a teenager in the 1970s, fleeing a regime where religious expression was suppressed, only to find a home in the sun-drenched freedom of Bondi. A successful businessman and philanthropist, Reuven had divided his time between Sydney and Melbourne to ensure his daughter, Shayna, received the best possible Jewish education. Yet his heart remained anchored in the Bondi community where he had first discovered his identity. On this evening, Reuven was in his element, moving through the crowd with a broad smile, shaking hands, and sharing laughs with Rabbi Eli Schlanger, the assistant rabbi at Chabad Bondi, who had helped organize the festivities. The sensory details of the evening were rich and comforting. The salty tang of the Pacific Ocean mixing with the savory aroma of lax frying in oil, the sound of children laughing on the carnival rides, and the rhythmic beat of traditional music playing over the loudspeakers. It was a scene of perfect, idyllic normalcy, a celebration of light in a world that often feels consumed by darkness. And Reuven stood as a pillar of that community, unaware that he was enjoying the final moments of his life. As the sun began to dip below the urban skyline, casting the golden hour light across the faces of the attendees, the ceremony moved toward its central ritual, the lighting of the menorah. The timing was significant. Hanukkah commemorates the miracle of the oil in the temple, a victory of the few against the many, and the lighting of the first candle at sunset symbolizes the triumph of spiritual light over physical darkness. Among the crowd waiting for this sacred moment were the most vulnerable members of society, whose presence underscored the multi-generational nature of the event. There was Matilda, a bright-eyed 10-year-old girl, likely vibrating with the excitement of the holiday and the promise of treats, standing near the petting zoo or the stage. There was Alexander Clateman, an elderly man in his 80s who carried the physical and emotional scars of the Holocaust, a survivor of history's greatest industrial slaughter who had come to Bondi to live out his final years in peace. The presence of a Holocaust survivor at a Hanukkah celebration is a powerful statement of continuity, a living link to the past that the community honors with deep reverence. The juxtaposition of Matilda's youth and Alexander's age represented the full spectrum of Jewish life, a chain of tradition that was about to be violently assaulted. The air was cooling, the wind from the ocean was picking up, and as the rabbi prepared the first flame, the crowd hushed in anticipation, a collective holding of breath that would soon be brutally expelled in a scream of collective terror. At 6:47 p.m., the sanctity of the evening was shattered by a sound that did not belong in the leisure-soaked landscape of Bondi Beach. From their elevated perch on the stone footbridge, Naveed and Sajid Akram had established a commanding field of fire that turned the geography of Archer Park against its occupants. The bridge acted as a sniper's nest, allowing them to fire down into the dense crowd with impunity while remaining partially obscured from the view of those below. The first shot was a sharp, dry crack, a high-velocity snap that echoed off the surrounding buildings and the concrete of the pavilion. To the uninitiated ear, gunfire in an open, festive environment rarely registers immediately as a threat. The brain, in a desperate attempt to maintain its equilibrium, searches for a benign explanation. Finn Foster, a Canadian tourist who was backpacking nearby, later recalled that his first instinct was to assume the noise was fireworks, a reasonable assumption given the celebratory nature of the event. This normalcy bias is a well-documented psychological phenomenon in disaster scenarios, a fatal hesitation where seconds are lost to confusion as the mind struggles to process data that violates its understanding of the world. For those few precious moments, the crowd remained static, heads turning in curiosity rather than fear, searching the sky for the colorful burst of pyrotechnics that would never come, unknowingly presenting themselves as stationary targets for the gunmen above. The illusion of safety evaporated with the second and third shots, which came in rapid succession, establishing a rhythmic, mechanical cadence of death that was unmistakably the sound of automatic or semi-automatic fire. The realization rippled through the crowd like a physical shockwave. The curiosity turned instantly to primal terror as the bullets began to find their marks, tearing through the thin canvas of the tents and the soft flesh of the attendees. From the bridge, the Akrams were not firing wildly. They were hunting, as noted by investigators who later analyzed the ammunition belts and the methodical nature of their targeting. They were firing into a target-rich environment, a cold military term that fails to capture the horror of shooting into a playground filled with families. Naveed, the son, focused his fire on the density of the crowd in the park, while Sajid, the father, initially covered the street level on Campbell Parade, ensuring that no one could rush their position from the rear. The elevated position gave them a terrifying advantage. They could see the flow of the panic, track the movement of the stampede, and adjust their fire to maximize casualties. The snaps of the bullets breaking the sound barrier were now accompanied by the screams of the wounded and the terrifying thud of rounds impacting the earth and bodies, a cacophony of violence that drowned out the festive music and signaled the beginning of the massacre. Inside Archer Park, the geography that had made the location so perfect for a community gathering, a grassy, enclosed bowl protected from the wind, suddenly transformed into a lethal trap. The park is bordered by the beach on one side, the pavilion on another, and the steep incline leading up to the road on the third, creating a confined space with limited egress points. As the firing intensified, the crowd of 1,000 people surged in a chaotic, terrified mass, pushing away from the bridge and toward the only perceived safety, the ocean or the concrete shelter of the Surf Life Saving Club. The panic was absolute. Parents threw their bodies over their children, pressing them into the dirt in a desperate bid to shield them from the hail of lead raining down from the bridge. The soft grass and sand, usually so forgiving underfoot, became a hindrance, slowing the escape and causing people to stumble and fall, creating piles of bodies that became easy targets for the gunmen. The air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder drifting down from the street, mixing with the iron sin of blood that was already beginning to stain the picnic blankets and the green turf. Witness Arsen Ostrovsky described the scene as pure evil, just an absolute bloodbath, a description that captures the sheer scale of the violation. A place of laughter had been turned into a slaughterhouse in less than 60 seconds. In the midst of this chaotic hellscape, Reuven Morrison made a choice that would define his legacy and end his life. While the natural instinct of the reptilian brain is to flee or freeze, Reuven's higher functions, his moral compass, honed by a lifetime of community service and perhaps the inherited trauma of his ancestors, drove him to act. He did not run away from the danger. He stood his ground. Witnesses later described seeing the large, imposing man trying to marshal people to safety, using his physical bulk to shield others, and shouting instructions to get down and move back. A close friend recounted that Reuven was trying to get people to get down out of the way and then maybe disarm the shooter on the ground, indicating that he may have been attempting to charge toward the threat or at least create a distraction to buy time for the women and children to escape. He was a shepherd protecting his flock until the very end. Tragically, his size and his refusal to stay low made him a prominent target. He was struck by the gunfire while in the act of saving others, collapsing near the stage where he had been laughing just moments before. He died there on the grass, surrounded by the community he loved, his blood mingling with the soil of the country that had given him freedom, a hero who spent his final golden hour, not in fear, but in a defiant, sacrificial act of love. The chronology of a mass casualty event is rarely recorded in linear seconds by human memory. Instead, it is reconstructed later through the digital timestamps of emergency calls and the metadata of smartphone videos. At 6:47 p.m., the first call to 000 was logged, marking the official transition of Bondi Beach from a place of leisure to a theater of war. The operator on the other end of the line would have heard a cacophony that defied immediate categorization. The high-pitched screaming of children, the frantic instructions of parents, and, cutting through it all, the rhythmic mechanical crack-crack-crack of high-velocity rifles. On Campbell Parade, the arterial road that separates the sand from the city, the scene was one of kinetic bedlam. Vehicles that had been cruising slowly in the Sunday traffic suddenly became cages. Drivers slammed on their brakes or swerved onto the median strip in a desperate attempt to escape the kill zone, creating a gridlock of steel that trapped pedestrians in the open. It was in this chaotic crush that Dan El-Qayyim, a French national in his 20s, found himself exposed. El-Qayyim had come to Australia, like thousands of others, to experience the celebrated Lucky Country, only to be confronted with a violence that felt imported from the darkest corners of geopolitical conflict. Reports indicate he was struck during the initial volley while attempting to navigate the confusion near the pedestrian crossing. His death was instantaneous, a tragic example of the arbitrary nature of terror where geographical proximity dictates survival. The bullets that tore through the air were not aiming for him specifically. They were aiming for the idea of safety itself, turning a backpacker's holiday into a forensic statistic in a matter of milliseconds. Among those caught in the open was Peter Maher, a retired police officer in his 60s, whose final actions provided a heartbreaking counter-narrative to the panic consuming the street. Psychological literature on retired first responders often discusses the protector identity, a deep-seated neurological pathway that overrides the flight response even years after leaving the service. While the vast majority of the crowd was governed by the sympathetic nervous system's imperative to run, Maher's training likely engaged. Witnesses suggest he did not dive for cover immediately, but turned toward the source of the sound, perhaps attempting to identify the threat or usher civilians into the alcoves of the nearby shops. He was facing the danger when he was hit. The ballistics of the engagement were overwhelmingly in favor of the shooters. Sajid Akram, positioned on the street level, was effectively using the parked cars as blinds, firing into the mass of people who were bottlenecked against the shop fronts. Maher's death removed a potential leader from the chaotic street scene, leaving the civilians leaderless in the face of the assault. The air on Campbell Parade was now thick with tire smoke and the scent of propellant. The festive lights of the cafes flickered over bodies that lay still on the asphalt, while the Hanukkah by the sea, music continued to play in the distance, a macabre soundtrack to the unfolding slaughter. The timeline had advanced only 90 seconds since the first shot, Yet the world as these victims knew it had been irrevocably unmade. While the carnage unfolded on the pavement, a different psychological drama was taking place just meters away, inside the mind of Ahmed al-Ahmed. A 43-year-old father and owner of a fruit shop in the Sutherland Shire, Ahmed was a man defined by the quiet dignity of hard work and family devotion. He was seated at a cafe near Hall Street, a cup of coffee in front of him, enjoying the brief respite that the Sunday evening offered before the start of another work week. The location places him at the periphery of the primary kill zone, close enough to feel the percussion of the shots, but momentarily screened from the direct line of sight of the shooters. When the firing began, Ahmed's reaction was not one of immediate comprehension. Violence of this magnitude is so foreign to the Australian context that the mind rejects it, but as the screaming began and the crowd surged past his table, the reality set in. He saw Sajid Akram. The older gunman was moving with a terrifying deliberation, his weapon raised, firing at unarmed people who were scrambling for their lives. Ahmed was unarmed. He was a civilian. He had a family waiting for him at home. Every evolutionary instinct he possessed screamed at him to stay low, to blend into the architecture, to wait for the professionals to arrive. The bystander effect, a social psychological phenomenon where individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim when other people are present, usually paralyzes crowds in such moments. The diffusion of responsibility convinces the individual that someone else will handle it. However, Ahmed al-Ahmed did not succumb to this paralysis. In interviews given by his family later, they would describe a man who couldn't bear to see people dying, a statement that points to a profound level of empathetic distress that overrode his self-preservation instincts. He watched as Sajid Akram reoriented his weapon, perhaps reloading or selecting a new group of targets. In that split second, Ahmed calculated the distance. He realized that the police were minutes away, and in those minutes, dozens more could die. The decision to act was likely not a verbalized thought, but a somatic impulse, a surge of adrenaline that cleared his vision of everything except the man in the black shirt and white trousers. He stood up. He left the safety of the cafe. He did not run away from the sound of the gun. He ran toward it. This transition from observer to participant is the rarest of human behaviors in active shooter scenarios. It requires a suppression of the amygdala's fear response that is usually only found in highly trained combat troops. Yet here it was displayed by a fruit seller in sandals. He moved through the chaos, weaving between the abandoned cars and fleeing pedestrians, closing the gap between himself and the terrorist. He was a single, unarmed man charging a fortified position, a frantic blur of white shirt against the smoke and shadows of the street, propelled by a desperate, singular need to stop the killing. The collision between Ahmed al-Ahmed and Sajid Akram was a moment of violent kinetic energy that disrupted the rhythm of the massacre. Ahmed hit the gunman from the flank, using the element of surprise to negate the advantage of the firearm. The footage of the incident, later analyzed by millions around the world, shows Ahmed crouching behind a silver sedan before launching himself at the shooter. He tackled Akram, his arms locking around the man's upper body, grappling for control of the rifle. The physical reality of such a struggle is brutal and intimate. It is a contest of leverage, strength, and desperation. The barrel of the rifle was hot from the rapid fire, searing the skin, but Ahmed did not let go. He managed to wrench the muzzle away from the crowd, pointing it toward the sky or the pavement. Akram, caught off guard by the ferocity of the assault, stumbled back, his firing stance broken. For a few critical seconds, the gun was silent. Ahmed had effectively jammed the cog of the killing machine. He shouted, perhaps a primal scream of effort, perhaps a warning to others to get down. He was wrestling not just a man, but the manifestation of hate itself, trying to physically restrain an ideology with his bare hands. But the dyad nature of the attack meant that Sajid was not alone. Whether it was Sajid regaining control of a secondary weapon or Naveed firing from the bridge, the response was lethal. A shot rang out at close range. Ahmed was struck in the arm and hand. The bullet tore through the soft tissue, shattering bone and severing the radial nerve, the pathway that controls the ability to extend the wrist and fingers. The impact would have felt like being hit by a sledgehammer, the kinetic energy knocking him backward and breaking his grip on the attacker. Pain, white-hot and blinding, flooded his system. He collapsed onto the asphalt, blood pouring from his limb, his capacity to fight extinguished by the trauma. However, his intervention had achieved its strategic goal. The shooter had been forced to stop firing at the crowd to deal with the threat Ahmed posed. The rhythm of the attack was broken. The psychological dominance of the gunman was shattered. They were no longer invincible predators, but men who could be challenged. As Ahmed lay bleeding on Campbell Parade, the sirens of the approaching police units grew louder, filling the void he had created. He had bought the golden hour for the people in the park, paying for it with the use of his own hand. The response of the New South Wales police force was dictated by a doctrine forged in the fires of the Link Cafe siege and the Paris attacks, the Active Armed Offender Guidelines. In previous decades, the standard procedure for a siege was contain and negotiate, establish a perimeter, call in negotiators, and wait. But in an active shooter scenario, where every second equals a life, that doctrine is obsolete. The general duties officers from the Eastern Suburbs Police Area Command who arrived at the scene knew that they were the blue team, the first line of defense who had to enter the hot zone immediately, regardless of their equipment limitations. They arrived in standard patrol cars, armed with Glock pistols, facing suspects equipped with long-arm rifles and superior elevation. There was no hesitation. The dashcam footage from the first arriving vehicles captures the speed of the deployment. Officers exited their vehicles while they were still rolling, drawing their sidearms, and moving toward the sound of gunfire. They bypassed the wounded, a harrowing violation of the paramedics' instinct to heal, because the primary objective was to neutralize the threat. To stop the killing, they had to ignore the dying. The engagement that followed on Campbell Parade was short, sharp, and decisive. Sajid Akram, having just disentangled himself from the struggle with Ahmed, was now the primary focus of the police advance. He was engaged by multiple officers. The exchange of fire was intense, echoing off the sandstone walls of the Bondi pavilion. Sajid, refusing to surrender and raising his weapon against the officers, was struck multiple times. The terminal ballistics of the police rounds ended the threat instantly. He fell to the pavement, his body coming to rest not far from where Ahmed lay wounded. The death of the father, the architect of the plot, marked the turning point of the battle. The police did not stop to celebrate. They immediately scanned for the second threat. The radio channels were clogged with urgent, frantic updates. One offender down, looking for second, suspect on a bridge. The discipline of the officers in that moment, to transition instantly from a lethal engagement to a tactical search, prevented the remaining shooter from capitalizing on the chaos. The blue team had held the line. On the footbridge above the car park, Naveed Akram was now isolated. The psychological ecosystem of the dyad had been severed. His father was dead on the street below. The bridge, which moments ago had been a position of tactical dominance, offering enfilade fire into the park, had now become a trap. He was exposed, silhouetted against the sky, with no route of escape that did not lead into a police cordon. The tactical advantage had shifted entirely to the state. The Tactical Operations Unit, arriving in their armored Bearcats and heavy vests, began to close the net. These officers, equipped with M4 carbines and advanced optics, moved with the precision of a surgical team. They utilized the cover of the parked cars and the terrain of the park to maneuver into positions that cut off Naveed's angles of fire. The noise of the sirens was now deafening, a wall of sound that disoriented the remaining gunmen. The final confrontation was inevitable. Naveed, whether through a desire for suicide by cop or a final act of futile resistance, remained a threat. He was engaged by police fire. He was struck and critically injured, the fight leaving him as he collapsed onto the stone of the bridge. Unlike his father, he did not die at the scene. Officers moved in rapidly, kicking the weapon away and securing his hands in cuffs. The transition from enemy combatant to custodial patient happened in an instant. The same officers who had shot him moments before now applied first aid, staunching the flow of blood, a testament to the rigid ethics of the law enforcement profession. He was taken into custody, a living piece of evidence who would face the justice system of the democracy he had tried to destroy. As Naveed was dragged away and the scene-safe command was broadcast over the radio, a heavy, unnatural silence descended on Bondi. The shooting had stopped, but for the survivors emerging from their hiding spots in the park, and for the families watching the news break around the world, the nightmare was only just beginning. The sun had fully set, and the darkness over Bondi was absolute. As the immediate tactical fury of the gun battle on Campbell Parade subsided, leaving the body of Sajid Akram motionless on the asphalt and his son Naveed bleeding and handcuffed on the footbridge, the operational tempo of the first responders shifted from neutralization to containment. However, the silence that should have signaled safety was short-lived. In the forensic sweep of the Akram's silver hatchback, parked just 15 meters from the bridge entrance, police officers discovered a threat that threatened to escalate the tragedy into a catastrophe of significantly larger proportions. Inside the vehicle, concealed amidst the mundane clutter of a car interior, were suspicious items that were quickly identified by the rescue and bomb disposal unit as improvised explosive devices. This discovery fundamentally altered the classification of the event from a mass shooting to a complex, coordinated terrorist attack designed with a secondary kill stage. The placement of the vehicle was not accidental. It was parked in a high-traffic zone where first responders, media crews, and evacuating civilians would naturally congregate following the initial gunfire. The strategic logic of such devices, often seen in asymmetric warfare zones rather than Australian coastal suburbs, is to target the helpers, to maim the paramedics, police officers, and brave bystanders who rush into the void to save lives. The realization sent a chill through the command center. An exclusion zone was immediately established and expanded, pushing the terrified crowds back hundreds of meters from the beachfront, turning the iconic strip into a ghostly, strobe-lit vacuum. The bomb disposal officers, clad in heavy Kevlar protective suits that resemble astronaut gear, moved in with robotic platforms to neutralize the devices, working with the terrifying knowledge that a single wrong move could detonate a blast wave capable of shredding the nearby storefronts and anyone unfortunate enough to be within the blast radius. The psychological impact of the IED discovery cannot be overstated. It revealed the depth of the Akram's nihilism and the extent of their planning. This was not a crime of passion or a spontaneous outburst of rage. It was a calculated attempt to maximize human suffering. The devices were likely intended to act as a force multiplier, creating chaos that would divert police resources and clog the medical evacuation routes. Had they detonated during the initial minutes of the police response, the death toll would likely have doubled, claiming the lives of the very officers who had just neutralized the shooters. As the bomb squad worked methodically under the glare of floodlights, the what-if scenarios played out in the minds of every commander on the ground. The presence of the IEDs also triggered a massive, simultaneous intelligence surge. If the Akrams had the capability to manufacture bombs, did they have a workshop? Were there other devices planted in the city? The investigation instantly expanded from the crime scene at Bondi to the Akram family home in Bonnyrigg and potentially other locations across Sydney. The discovery of an Islamic State flag inside the vehicle further cemented the ideological motivation, linking the carnage at Bondi to a global narrative of hate. For the residents of Bondi, huddled in the back of shops or watching from apartment windows, the sight of the bomb robot rolling down Campbell Parade was a surreal imposition of war upon their peaceful suburb, a visual confirmation that the safety they took for granted had been completely dismantled. Inside Archer Park, the scene was a tableau of devastation that defied the comprehension of those who walked it. As the scene-safe order was broadcast, albeit tentatively, given the IED threat nearby, paramedics from NSW Ambulance moved from the cold zone into the warm zone, initiating the grim calculus of battlefield triage. The grass, usually dotted with picnic blankets and families enjoying the sunset, was now slick with blood and strewn with the debris of the festival, abandoned strollers, overturned chairs, and Hanukkah decorations fluttering in the breeze. The triage teams operated under the START protocol, a system designed to do the greatest good for the greatest number in a mass casualty event. They moved rapidly from body to body, attaching color tags that dictated the patient's fate. Green for the walking wounded, yellow for urgent but stable, red for immediate life-threatening injuries, and black for the deceased. The air was filled with the unique, metallic smell of high-velocity trauma, mixed with the salt air and the lingering scent of frying oil from the food stalls. The injuries presented were horrific. Rifle rounds travel at supersonic speeds, creating a temporary cavity in human tissue that could be 10 times the diameter of the bullet, pulverizing bone and organs. For the paramedics, many of whom were accustomed to dealing with car accidents or cardiac arrests, the sheer volume of penetrating trauma was overwhelming. They worked on their knees in the dirt, applying tourniquets, packing wounds with hemostatic gauze, and inserting airways, fighting to stabilize patients whose lives were slipping away by the second. The logistics of the evacuation were a feat of high-stakes coordination. St. Vincent's Hospital in Darlinghurst, the nearest Level 1 trauma center, became the focal point of the medical response. A convoy of ambulances, their sirens wailing in a discordant symphony, ferried the critical patients away from the coast. Among the wounded was Ahmed al-Ahmed, the fruit seller whose arm had been shattered in his heroic struggle with the gunman. He was loaded onto a stretcher, pale and in shock but alive. The most heart-wrenching scenes, however, involve the children. Pediatric trauma is a nightmare for any first responder. The physiological reserves of a child are smaller, and their deterioration can be rapid and silent. For children were rushed to the Sydney Children's Hospital in Randwick, their small bodies engulfed by the equipment designed to save them. Tragically, for 10-year-old Matilda, the intervention came too late. She was tagged black at the scene, her life extinguished amidst the playground equipment where she should have been safe. The separation of families and the chaos added a layer of psychological torture to the physical pain. Parents who had been separated from their children in the stampede pleaded with officers for information, their voices rising in panic as they were held back by the police cordons. The golden hour, that critical 60-minute window where survival rates are highest, was ticking away, and every decision made on that blood-soaked grass determined who would wake up the next morning and who would become a name on a memorial. At St. Vincent's Hospital, the mass casualty incident plan had been activated, transforming the facility into a fortress of emergency medicine. The code blue alerts summoned surgeons, anesthesiologists, and nurses from their homes, many arriving in civilian clothes, driven by the singular imperative to save lives. The emergency department was locked down to control the flow of patients and secure the facility against any potential secondary attacks. As the ambulances arrived in waves, the trauma bays became hives of controlled chaos. The injuries treated were consistent with a war zone: shattered femurs, perforated abdomens, and massive hemorrhaging. For the medical teams, the emotional weight of the night was set aside in favor of technical precision. There was no time to mourn the tragedy, while there were vessels to clamp and airways to secure. The hospital corridors, usually quiet on a Sunday night, were filled with the squeak of gurneys and the urgent, clipped communication of medical professionals. Every resource of the state's premier trauma center was thrown into the fight, with operating theaters running back-to-back surgeries well into the dawn. In one of those theaters, Ahmed al-Ahmed lay under the bright surgical lights. His injuries were severe. The bullet from the terrorist's weapon had caused significant damage to his upper extremity, specifically compromising the radial nerve. The radial nerve is crucial for the motor function of the arm, wrist, and fingers. Its injury results in wrist drop and a loss of sensation that can be permanent if not treated with exacting skill. The microsurgery required to repair such damage is delicate and time-consuming. Surgeons had to debride the damaged tissue, removing bone fragments and debris, before attempting to bridge the gap in the nerve fibers. The recovery prognosis for such an injury is measured in millimeters. Peripheral nerves regenerate at a painfully slow rate of approximately 1 millimeter per day. For Ahmed, a man who worked with his hands, lifting crates of fruit. The injury threatened his livelihood as well as his life. As he slept under anesthesia, his family gathered in the waiting room, a mix of terror and pride washing over them. They spoke to the media, describing him as a man who doesn't discriminate and who acted on pure conscience. He had gone into the hospital a fruit seller and would wake up a national hero. But the physical price of his bravery would be a scar that would run the length of his arm and a rehabilitation journey that would take months, if not years. In the days following the massacre, the grief of the community was compounded by the furious intensity of the investigation. The Akram family home in Bondi became the epicenter of a forensic dismantle, with police in hazmat suits removing bag after bag of evidence. The revelation that Naveed Akram had been known to ASIO, albeit not as an immediate threat, sparked a national debate about the adequacy of surveillance and the thresholds for intervention. But for the families of the victims, the politics were background noise to the crushing silence of loss. The Jewish community of Sydney, one of the most vibrant in the diaspora, mobilized to bury its dead. According to Jewish custom, the burial must take place as soon as possible, a final act of respect for the deceased. The Chevra Kadisha performed the Tahara, the ritual washing and purification of the bodies, treating the shattered remains of the victims with extreme tenderness and reverence. They were wrapped in simple white linen shrouds, emphasizing that in death, there is no distinction between the wealthy businessman and the pensioner. The funeral of Reuven Morrison was a scene of overwhelming sorrow. Thousands gathered at Rookwood Cemetery to pay their respects to the man who had escaped the Soviet Union only to fall in Sydney. The wooden coffin, unadorned and simple, was lowered into the earth. The sound of the dirt hitting the lid, thud, 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 echoed the finality of the event. Friends and family took turns shoveling the earth, a physical act of closure known as Chesid Shel Emet, for it is a favor that the deceased can never repay. The mourner's Kaddish was recited, a prayer that paradoxically does not mention death, but praises God, affirming faith in the face of the void. Yikadol Yikadash Shmei Rabbah. The voices chanted, wavering with tears. Rabbi Eli Schlanger, the spiritual leader who had dedicated his life to the Chabad mission, was also laid to rest, leaving a spiritual vacuum in the heart of Bondi. The community sat Shiva, the traditional 7 days of mourning, covering mirrors and sitting on low stools, as the reality of the empty chair at the Shabbat table began to set in. The loss was not just personal, it was communal. A generation of wisdom, represented by Holocaust survivor Alexander Clayton, and a future of potential, represented by 10-year-old Matilda, had been stolen in a single evening. Hanukkah is a festival of 8 nights. The attack had occurred on the first night, plunging the festival into a darkness that felt absolute. But the calendar of Jewish life is relentless, and the message of Hanukkah is specifically about the endurance of light in the face of oppression. On Monday, December 22nd, the 8th and final night of the festival, a decision was made. The community would return to Archer Park. They would not be driven away. The atmosphere at Bondi Beach that evening was visibly different from the first night. The carefree carnival vibe was replaced by a somber, steely determination. The security presence was overwhelming. Police snipers were positioned on the roof of the Bondi Pavilion, drones buzzed overhead, and tactical units stood guard at every entrance. Yet the people came. They came by the thousands, Jews and non-Jews, locals and tourists, filling the grassy bowl where the blood had been spilled just a week prior. A new menorah stood tall against the backdrop of the darkening ocean. Rabbi Levi Wolf and the surviving leadership of Chabad took the stage, their faces drawn but their voices steady. They spoke not of vengeance, but of resilience. A little light expels a lot of darkness, the rabbi intoned, quoting a Chabad teaching that had never felt more urgent. As the sun set, marking the end of the golden hour that had been so violated 8 days earlier, the candles were lit. One by one, the flames flickered into life, dancing in the wind coming off the Pacific. They shone for Reuven. They shone for Matilda. They shone for Ahmed al-Ahmed, watching from his hospital bed, his arm bound but his spirit unbroken. The crowd sang Mao's Tour, a hymn of survival that has been sung for centuries. The scar on Bondi Beach would remain. The memory of the terror would never fully wash away with the tide. But as the 8 lights burned brightly in the darkness, the message was clear. The terror had failed. The community had been broken, but it had not been defeated. They had returned to the scene of their greatest pain to reclaim it with light. The scars on the pavement have faded, but the memory remains. In the face of absolute darkness, ordinary people became heroes, and a community found its way back to the light. Thank you for listening to The Golden Hour.